we started to think through how is the business going to survive? And then how, as an organization, are we going to lead an industry through this?
George Hershman's term as chair of Solar's leading trade group began with optimism and excitement. He stepped into the role with the Solar Energy Industries Association, or SEIA, in January 2020, when the industry's meteoric rise was all but cemented. By now, we know the tumultuous stretch that quickly followed. A pandemic, supply chain constraints, and a potentially existential tariff fight made even the solar coaster moniker appear ill-equipped to describe the moment. But the stint also featured a legacy-defining legislative victory in the Inflation Reduction Act. I'm John Engel, editor-in-chief of Renewable Energy World. This week on Factor This, SOLV Energy CEO George Hershman joins us to take us inside the critical behind-the-scenes deliberations that help save solar. As he prepares to vacate his chairmanship at the end of the year, Hershman defended SEIA's aggressive battle with the Biden administration in the Auxin Solar tariff fight, shared the organization's own battle to stay afloat, and laid out a vision for smoother seas ahead. That's all next on Factor This from Renewable Energy World. George Hershman, welcome back to the Factor This podcast. It's great to see you.
Well, good to see you again, John. Thank you for having me back.
We were joking before we started recording that I don't know if this makes you smart or dumb for coming back to the show. I hope it's the former.
Yes, absolutely. Happy to be back.
And for those of you
lucky to be back.
I appreciate that. That's a nice way to start this. For those of you who missed George's first appearance on the show, he joined episode 20 to talk about NIMBY issues and SOLV Energy's work on the Mammoth Solar project, the largest project in development in the U.S., which I believe is nearing a very exciting milestone based on what I've heard from your development partners on that first phase. Maybe you can talk about that here in a second, but I'll put a link to that episode in the episode notes. But George, do you want to share any updates from Mammoth? I heard 90% complete on phase one. Is that accurate?
That is true. We're looking to try to get it turned on, a section of the plant turned on this year. So the team is working really hard to get the first phase interconnected and looking forward to starting the second phase. We've built a really strong team and partnership with Doral and looking forward to continuing to work out there as we work through the multiple phases of that really exciting project.
And Doral sent over to me some cool pictures. They're experimenting with which livestock would be best suited for that environment. They've got sheep out there, alpaca, llamas, all that kind of stuff. So that's kind of cool to see. And you'll see that in our reporting here very soon with Renewable Energy World. But today, George, I'm excited to dive in and unpack your tenure as chairman of the Solar Energy Industries Association board, which is now concluding. I don't know if it's over yet. You may still have power and responsibility for a few more months, right?
I do until the end of the year. So I have one more board meeting in December. We'll oversee the budget for 2024, and then turn over the gavel to the next chair. So pretty exciting time. If you look at what the industry did over the last 4 years, my tenure had a lot of interesting times to go through,
to say the least. And we're going to get into each of those here in a minute. And for those of you who are not daily on LinkedIn, you wouldn't know that the campaigns for SEIA board are well underway already. People are jockeying for their positions there. So that'll be fun to see play out over the next few months. Let's go back to the beginning when you were elected as board chairman or appointed after being elected to the board. You can correct me on that one. But I imagine you started bright-eyed and bushy-tailed in January of 2020, ready to reshape the industry and lead it in its next stage of prominence, only to be met by some pretty significant headwinds each year of your tenure there as board chair. It may be remembered as the most tumultuous stretch that the solar and storage industries have faced yet. The way I see it, in that time period, George, you were dealing with the coronavirus pandemic first. You went on to the Auxin Solar tariff fight. Then we had the Inflation Reduction Act emerging from the ash heap of the Build Back Better Act. and then ongoing labor and supply chain strains. But just at a high level, we're going to break all those down in just a minute. What will you remember most about your tenure, and maybe some of the top line lessons learned before we piece those out?
Yeah, I mean, I think obviously you addressed a lot of the issues that we went through as an industry and as an industry association. We have to remember that SEIA is a business that we are all in, as members really invested in. So we had to look at not only how is the industry going to prosper and grow through all of those challenges, how is the industry association as a business going to manage through what was business crisis and personal crisis that we were all going through. So, I think that I will look back at a number of the, ultimate successes that we had when we look at where we sit today with IRA. But the interpersonal relationships that we built during those times, the relationship that I had with Abby Hopper, an amazing CEO of this organization, and how we worked together and managed through the personal crisis and challenges that we went through for, COVID, which unfortunately probably has never left us. And we're still having conversations today. I had a conversation with a customer yesterday that I couldn't meet with because they had COVID, right? We forget that it's still here. But those early months, as we started to think through how is the business going to survive? How are we going to deal with people where they were? How they're, the mental challenges that people were going through, all those things that an organization has to deal with. And then how, as an organization, are we going to lead an industry through this? Because it was a unique time where companies truly came together at every size, right? So there are organizations like ours that are large in scale, and then 2 and 3 person companies that had to deal with issues. And we were all coming together and sharing those experiences and trying to really educate each other, because it was really a learning process. And I think it brought the board and the industry together in a different way, because we understood each other and each other's needs much differently. We'd always been a corporate-led board, bunch of different companies, different ideas about the industry. I think during those first few years, we really came together personally, and that allowed us to deal with some of the bigger challenges that we had ahead, because I think we have shared so much about our organizations and, our personal challenges during those times. So it was really an interesting time, and I'm happy to have been a part of it. Now, when I look back, I'm not sure every day when I was sitting in my house like I am today, talking to Abby about how we were going to deal with a business that lost 80% of its revenue. If you consider the vast majority of its revenue come from in-person events like RE Plus that were canceled. And how are you going to be able to deal with that going into an election year when we needed to be as strong as we could be, because we absolutely needed an administration change that supported our industry.
I like that you point that out, that it is a business, and it's not just the advocacy and membership piece that is probably what we see SEIA most for, the event side. And you don't have to tell me that, George. I work for an event company. So we were very impacted by the pandemic. Our big one is on the utility side with Distributech International. But same thing. I mean, you're talking about, millions of dollars of revenue stopping on a dime. And it's not that, you pivot and do something else. That is a hole that is going to exist for some time unless the global health crisis goes away. So I probably shared a lot of pain with you guys who were trying to navigate that. But on the advocacy front, so SEIA is intimately involved in crafting clean energy policy, has close relationships with senior leaders in Congress and the White House, Abby being a big piece of that. So my goal for this conversation is for our audience to maybe get a peek behind the curtain a bit to see how some of these critical negotiations and deliberations played out, both internally and in conversations with stakeholders. But keeping with the pandemic, can you take us through some of those early strategy sessions that you had with Abby about the health crisis, about the impact to the industry, supply chain, all of that? And, of course, the event not being able to run that year is a big hit, but you're in large part responsible for helping hundreds of companies navigate this uncertainty. So what was that like one-to-one interaction with Abby like for you when you guys are like, where do we start and what's our role here?
We transitioned in January into our first board meeting with in-person board meeting in January, and talking about what 2020 was going to look like going into an election year, how we were going to strategize to support hopefully an administration change that really recognized renewables and was going to run on almost a clean energy platform. So we quickly took that strategy in January and February. And then if we all remember, by March 15th, the world had basically closed down. And so now we're looking at how do we, one, keep a business together that's losing a significant amount of its revenue, and continue to stay focused in delivering to the industry a supportive administration and getting the message out to Congress members, continuing to support a hopefully a new administration, but in the immediate, how do we get the message out to lawmakers that renewables are continuing to, drive energy growth in during the pandemic, and how our projects, largely the utility scale market that we serve, but even the residential market. I mean, these projects are, outdoors, safe distancing. Our traditional project is anywhere from, 2,000 acres, right, with 500 people. There's clearly distancing opportunities, how the industry can proceed safely. And so we were able to work through Department of Labor and get classifications around our workforce that allowed us to continue to work. I think we did a very good job of talking to lawmakers kind of on both sides of the aisle about renewables. And I think it was a unique time to have a lot of discussions on the Republican side for us, because most of our projects are in red districts. And if you remember, oil and gas went negative during those years because nobody was driving. There was just demand for oil and gas was down so significantly that we were transitioning workforce in our West Texas projects from oil and gas companies into renewables because we were still working and they weren't. I think early on, it was a lot about how we're going to provide businesses with those tools to get out and continue to work, while we're sitting there saying, how are we going to continue as an industry association with less revenue? We worked hard to minimize layoffs and minimize impacts because we knew everybody was going through it. And so I think did a really good job of balancing our budget and our needs and still supporting the industry, because we were committed to our people. Abby was committed as a leader to her people, and they did a lot of really hard things, right? They cut back as a leadership team. They unfortunately, there were layoffs during those periods of time, and we dealt with those appropriately and people appropriately. And we have ultimately, I think the industry association weathered the storm and came out stronger. And, by the end of 2020, we had a new administration. We looked like we were going to come out of the pandemic. There was vaccines either here or on the horizon. And it looked like we were going to get back into a more normal state with, a lot of excitement around what was to be Build Back Better.
And then what happened instead, maybe simultaneous of the push for Build Back Better, was the Auxin Solar tariff petition. So as you mentioned, by February 2022, a lot of the economy had opened back up. We're still dealing with COVID, and we still are today, so not to minimize it. But the Auxin Solar tariff petition essentially formalizes a previous push by unnamed manufacturers to levy tariffs on solar modules imported from Southeast Asia, which accounts for around 80% of project supply in the US. And for many developers, then around that March-April timeframe, when Commerce decides to take up the investigation, everything stops again. That they can't import modules out of risk of retroactive tariffs. It is seen as a potential existential threat to the industry, at least in the near term. What were your initial feelings around that? We'll get more into the case,
Sure,
as we talk. But your initial reaction to that case getting taken up, and how did that inform SEIA's response?
Well, I think my initial response was, here we go again, right? I have been involved in tariff cases now over imported modules since 2012, maybe 11, when we had AVCVD 1, the very first case, around, started by a single U.S. manufacturer that supplied a small portion of the industry, but was at least a going concern at that time, right? Solar World made a significant residential module facility in Washington, in Oregon. And so we started back then. So, part of it was like, here we go again. I've been on the opposition side of these trade cases for years now, because I see the devastation they have in the market, right? That they never have provided the manufacturing pathway that they propose to fix. And so when we got into the Auxin case, it was just another step in the process, right? We've had AVCVD cases, we've had the 201 cases that we're still in the midst of now, and then the Auxin case, and the Auxin case effectively shut down the market at a time where we had huge belief that the market was supported, was growth. We were working through, what looked like significant legislation to support the industry. And then now we're dealing with a manufacturer and and likely others, right? I mean, Auxin was the proxy for others that would look to impact this industry.
And now, just George, just for the record, because we have had the CEO of Auxin on this podcast, Mamoun Rashid, and I did ask him that, whether you believe him or not, and many don't. He did say that he was acting only on the behalf of Auxin Solar and no one else. So I do need to throw in that little disclaimer.
Yes, fair enough. And I've heard those claims many times, but it's hard to kind of square that circle when you look at the impacts and the value to that organization and the need from that organization to bring on this type of case. But fair enough. Even if it is only one company's case and direction, it clearly had mass oversized impact for the benefit that it would bring a single company. And so, we effectively saw our market close. Utility scale projects, because of the cost impacts, were just frozen. So we demobilized projects. We laid off thousands of workers across the country ourselves, just as a company, let alone an industry. And, it almost has been a continuous kind of knock-on effect. I mean, because then you think about after Auxin, or threaded into Auxin, was the UFLPA, right, which impacted polycrystalline from China, and which also has then dramatically, impacted imports of modules. So we've been going through this kind of supply chain around modules for years now. And so as we continue to now see what we believe will be a robust industry supported by IRA, we're still being challenged today by supply chain affected by the Auxin case and the we're running the clock out on the 2-year stay. So we're running the clock out on that. And then obviously we have to deal with that at the end. And then the importing of modules and the stoppage by Customs and Border Patrol is still ongoing today as we're going through investigations of modules. And we're seeing a much cleaner supply chain, which I think we all want. Nobody wants modules that have forced labor, component embedded into modules. Nobody wants that, right? So the good news is the industry has done a lot of good things ahead of, because probably too many acronyms, but we had the WRO before that, right? So before the UFLPA. So we've been dealing with module and polycrystalline issues for a long time. The industry has gotten a lot better about where its supply chain is coming from, probably better than most industries now, because we've had such a heightened focus on it. So, that was and still continues to be a challenge that the industry is facing. I mean, that is really, I think, the kind of biggest challenge that the industry and the industry association has to deal with. Is there is a kind of a bipolar nature of where the industry is today. If you think about it, we should be doing a victory lap around the country on how successful IRA should and could be. And then we are still having projects today that are not moving forward because of supply chain challenges around modules. So, in the very same meeting where we met with John Podesta early on, probably 2 weeks into the IRA and his appointment into the essentially the administrator.
The implementation czar for IRA is kind of what I refer to him as, but I don't think that's the official title.
That's a good one. I mean, 2 weeks after I think he was anointed that position, we met with him and said, look this is all great, but I just laid off 1,000 people in Carbon County, Utah, the place in the country that we want to win the hearts and minds of people, that solar is the new energy industry. And we've laid people off because we can't get modules. So we need to, and this is being done by, CBP, or your own administration is controlling this flow of modules and the ability to deliver projects. So, we have a long way to go to get to U.S. manufacturing. We have years of buildup. And the great news is we've had a lot of really positive announcements for manufacturers to come to the U.S. and we've had, Hanwha is investing and building today. We've had, 50 announcements, I think, of different manufacturers in the supply chain. But that doesn't happen overnight. So we need to ensure that we have supply chains that can get us to that manufacturing base. And we don't have that today. And I think that is one of the frustrations that the industry has. And one of the things that, as industry association chair, I hear most about from companies. They're saying we have all these policies in alignment. Everything is set up for us to be successful. And then, we have these couple poison pills that just, really almost devastate the industry, or at least stagnate it, right? 22 and 23. 22 was down 50% from what, the Wood Mackenzie and many other industry kind of groups had forecasted, and us as an industry and as a company had forecasted. So 22 was down, 23 was relatively flat, and 24 is starting to rebuild. But that's the utility sector. The residential sector is fighting kind of battles across the country around net metering and other things as well. So while top line, we look like we have all of the tailwinds we need to grow an amazing industry, we have a lot of direct headwinds in many areas.
Yeah, and just to unpack a couple of the things you mentioned. So for those trying to read between the lines a little bit, and we're breezing over some acronyms and concepts because we've talked about it so much, but and I'm not saying you say this, George, but the rumblings within the industry were long that First Solar was the one propping up Auxin to make the push on tariffs in order to benefit their domestic supply chain, which is difficult to replicate on the crystalline side. So CadTel is much easier to make with domestically sourced materials, and they stood to gain from further tariffs on imported modules that rely on Southeast Asia and China. So that just a point there. The other piece on UFLPA, I have not seen a single argument or case made against those protections being put in place, only because of the seriousness of the transgressions that have been done against the Uyghurs in that region. And SEIA has been one of those groups that has said, full stop, we have to take care of this, and we cannot support supply chains that have ties to forced labor. That is something that many industries are dealing with that are connected to that region: electric vehicles, power electronics, cell phones, solar, all of it. So I appreciate you for mentioning that. But that's one of those pieces that, yes, it's a poison pill and a drag on the industry, but it's also like, we got to deal with it. And I think you echo that sentiment as well. Go ahead, George. You got something you want to add there?
Yeah, I think we absolutely are aligned on this. I think we understand that we cannot have a supply chain that has, that has product that's generated, manufactured through forced labor. So that is kind of full stop. And the industry association, and I think if you talk to anybody in this industry that runs companies like I do, that's full stop, right? That is something that we absolutely will not tolerate. The challenge that we've had is the enforcement process has been
very conservative.
It's been very conservative, and it's been difficult to get clear direction on how we get product through and how we prove that we have a supply chain that is clean and free of product coming out of the region. So I think that has been the biggest struggle, is the industry, buyers of product and suppliers of product have been aligned on, let us get in the room, tell us what you need, CBP, so that we can prove our product is clean. And so what we've seen is product that has either no Chinese poly in it, or Chinese poly that it comes from regions outside of Shenzhen. We see that those products are still being stocked for an indefinite amount of time. And so that has been the challenge, right? So I think it's more about, how do we get clear direction and enforcement, and how do we get enforcement that is uniform across all ports of entry? Because we're seeing that enforcement is different in certain areas. And, the CBP is a big organization, and trying to get all of their custom agents aligned is a difficult process. And so, we're talking about, tens of thousands and hundreds of thousands of containers coming in to supply this industry. And how do we deal with that? So it's more been around, the challenges that government bureaucracy have to try to deal with enforcement action like this. So it's more around enforcement than it is about the legitimacy of the law. I think we all agree on that.
Yeah, and correct me if I'm wrong, George, but I think in the last quarter or two, the flow has gotten much better. But you're right that early on, when UFLPA was, put into law, everything was getting stopped, almost everything. We were hearing about gigawatts being stopped at the border. So, that is a major impact. And so, point well taken on, we need a clear set of rules. Not to hop around too much, but just to kind of round out the Auxin thought here, you may be aware the podcast was actually launched because of the Auxin Solar tariff petition. Our first episode was with the CEO of Auxin Solar, Mamoon Rashid, and has at times been critical of some aspects of the industry's framing of that case. Trade groups included SEIA, American Clean Power Association, ACOR. There was this collaborative effort by the advocacy groups to launch a communications campaign, a pressure campaign with the Biden administration, millions of dollars. The figure I was given was $5 million from the former head of ACP in hopes of impacting this investigation one way or the other. And the message that was repeated on several occasions was that the Biden administration, in not so many words, had turned its back on clean energy, which had helped him get elected, was a vibrant piece of the economy. Hindsight's 2020, of course, but the Biden administration pushed through rich incentives for domestic solar manufacturing in the Inflation Reduction Act by including SEMA. And President Biden initially paused all new tariffs on solar modules imported from Southeast Asia until summer of 2024. That's the pause you were mentioning. But Commerce did determine that some manufacturers in Southeast Asia were in fact evading tariffs. And new penalties are likely to come once the president's moratorium sunsets if he doesn't extend it, which he said he wouldn't. First, I do welcome your reaction to that characterization, because I again launched this podcast because I felt the full picture was not necessarily being represented, that the industry had some responsibility for the set of circumstances that it now found itself in with a dependence on China and Southeast Asia. But secondly, if you can add color around the thinking behind that strategy, because it was very direct. There were no punches pulled when it came to, this needs to be stopped and this investigation needs to be, thrown out.
Look, we were unified. I mean, I guess unified is too big a word, because clearly there were groups within renewables that didn't support the industry association's position. And, whether that be SEIA or ACP, the former chair of ACP, probably the founding chair of ACP, I guess, in the conversion, Craig Cornelius is a close colleague and an industry friend. And we worked closely together as two industry associations. I think we're very closely aligned in this, is that the damage that this case was having on the overall industry, when you had a single company that could not supply, a fraction of the market, the U.S., the domestic supply was not in place to replace what was the only supply chain available. You had a difficult situation from an administration standpoint that was, outwardly supportive of clean energy and our industry, but had a Commerce Department that was effectively derailing their entire agenda. And so I think we, as an industry, pointed that out, right? We could not have the, administration officials going out touting the need for renewable energy, and it was the industry of the future, and companies that were on the front line like ours, and industries like and associations that were seeing the companies that we support devastated by layoffs and just loss of massive opportunity. Those two things were existing at the same time. And I think we as an industry were trying to point that out, that you have to find a solution. The solution is not shut down the entire industry. We have to find a way that I think, look, we all fought for domestic support through true industrial policy. The thing that this country has done poorly for decades is industrial policy. We've allowed industry to move. We had the technology. We had solar technology before anybody else, right? We had cell technology. We had all those things. We allowed those to move because we didn't have support for those industries. And a tariff regime doesn't create a avenue for industrial policy. What we did in IRA through the adoption of SEMA was create true industrial policy. For years, we've been pushing for, as an industry, because the only levers we had was tax equity and the ability to get those incentives moved forward, was continued to work on the buy side. How do we make the buy side better? How do we support through tax equity the buy side of these projects so that we recognize that these projects are capital intensive from an energy standpoint? If you think about it, you're building a project that has 25 years of its fuel built into it when you build it day one, right? You have unlike any other energy source that we have built in the past, traditional energy source, you're buying all of its fuel day one. So by design, they're capital intensive. So the investment tax credits worked really well because you had a capital intensive project. Imagine building, if you ran a financial model on a gas power plant that said, as part of the CapEx, I'm going to buy 25 years of fuel.
Or that the 25-year fuel supply was free, we'd have no solar.
Right.
We'd only have natural gas.
Exactly.
Yeah, that's a fair point.
So tax credits have worked really well for this industry. Now, so that's the buy side. How do we support the buy side? Drive down the cost of building it. What we didn't do until IRA, and one of the things that we pushed very hard as an industry and as association, was how are we going to create a supply side environment that was going to support the supply side in the US? That's where you have industrial policy. I think that's where, if we sit down as an industry and an industry association and say, what did we do the best? What we did the best was we created industrial policy for renewables in this country, probably for the first time in, our lifetime. That we recognized we created a supply side and a buy side economic. So we created an environment where companies want to come to the US, build product. They get support through tax incentives and production tax credits to build product in the US. And we've supported, a number of manufactured components in renewables. I would make an argument we didn't go far enough. If we look at the supply chain today, the biggest supply chain constraints we have in the market today are high voltage electrical equipment, because we have seen a challenge in the resiliency of our electric grid, right, through storms and wildfires. We've seen a need for, transformers and high voltage switches and to replace an aging infrastructure at a time we need more of those components. So unfortunately, we didn't deem those as renewable components, and there's no incentive for those manufacturers to significantly ramp their supply. I think we're getting that message out, and we're having a lot of discussions about that, because when you're talking about deployment, we used to talk about, do we have modules, right? First of all, do you have interconnect, right? Do you have permitting? You can think about all these things that are just what used to be long poles. And now we say, well, what's your high voltage switch gear look like? And the availability, when you're talking about a high voltage switch that may be 200 weeks out, how do you plan a project when a lead time for a piece of equipment that turns the plant online is 200 weeks out, right? We have to adjust those. We have to find those out. And that's an area I think that from an IRA standpoint or from a incentive standpoint, we need to look at differently. And we've been having those discussions. So, I think we did a lot of really good work, things I'm really excited about. There are a few things we left on the cutting room floor that I wish we would have gotten through. And in hindsight, I think we would have addressed some other equipment challenges within SEMA that would have addressed things other than tracker, inverter, and modules, which is, the top line equipment that everyone thinks about. There's a whole bunch of really important pieces of equipment that we need manufactured here in the US that we just haven't addressed.
And I think, George, most would agree with you that tariff policy on its own does not support a domestic industry. The tariffs alone are not going to lead to a robust domestic manufacturing sector in the US. Coupled with industrial policy like the Inflation Reduction Act, effective trade measures can support a domestic industry. And so just to put a bow on Auxin and move on from that chapter of the conversation, because I know it's cannibalized a lot of our talk today. Sure. I think my biggest issue with that, and you are not responsible for relitigating the Auxin case by any means. I think the reason I was so encouraged to start this podcast and dive into Auxin more was that statement that commerce had gone rogue to a degree, that the Biden administration was all in on clean energy, but here you have commerce doing this thing that was truly hurting the industry. And when you look at the statute, I think what Commerce said was, if you submit an application under the law that fits all the requirements, we don't have a choice but to investigate this thing. And so I didn't feel that nuance was added into the framing of why the Biden administration was investigating Auxin in the first place. Do you agree with that at all?
Yes, I think, obviously the statute is put into place to protect U.S. industry. So it is the obligation of Commerce to look at. It is not the obligation of Commerce to continue an investigation, right? They could have looked at the facts in this case. They could have recognized that the investigated the manufacturers that were, largely importing to the U.S. and seeing that the transformation of a cell, if you go back to ABCVD case, was happening in Asia outside of China, right? Which was the whole basis of the ABCVD case. So if you looked at what was, happening largely, not completely. I mean, I understand that the Commerce recognizes that there were bad actors, and we need to address those bad actors. Do we address the entire industry and shut down the entire industry for a period of time while we address those things? I think we all agreed that it could have been addressed differently, could have easily have identified the largest players in the U.S. market as companies that were doing the right thing based on ABCVD, right? They had moved the transformation of cell production outside of China, which is what the ABCVD case really addressed was, and when we get into the real nuances for your listeners about, what is the transformation of a cell what is origin of a module? That is where I think that it was already litigated, was already understood, and principally being adhered to by the largest players in the market. And we could have easily addressed the non-conforming actors differently.
Fair.
And I think that was our issue, is that this was taking a sledgehammer and not a scalpel to an issue we could have addressed. And you were doing it based on the petition of a manufacturer. And even if we can agree that it was just their decision to move forward, is that they were a small company supplying a very small portion of the industry and doing outsized damage to the industry as a whole. And so I think Commerce could have addressed it in different ways and looked at it in different ways. And I think that's what we wanted, is the administration to understand the overall impacts and how do we deal with it differently when we've had the rules of ABCVD for a long time, and companies and have invested based on those rules, and now we're relitigating it.
Yeah, George, I don't know if you're a football fan, but I compare the what is technologically significant to the what is a catch in the NFL. In that,
yes.
It's kind of, to expand it even more, the moving goalpost of how do we define this and what is real and what is not, and it's difficult. And I appreciate you for adding that detail into the response. I know I don't have you for much longer, and frankly, you may need to go right now. I don't know, but I will let you end this on a more positive note. Obviously, 4 years is tough to distill into an hour-long conversation, especially given how much took place during this tenure. But the Inflation Reduction Act has to be one of those career-defining moments for you, for your team, for the SEIA board, for everyone involved in pushing that legislation. And I don't want to move past that too quickly, because it really did redefine this industry's trajectory, and you should all be very proud of that. Can you take us into some of those negotiations behind the scenes? Because I've asked multiple people on this podcast about the where were you moment. I was cooking dinner when I got an alert on my phone that apparently Build Back Better isn't dead, and it's now called the Inflation Reduction Act because Senator Manchin was feeling good that day. Any fun stories from those weeks that led up to that surprise?
Well, it's interesting. I think I don't remember as much of where I was and what happened when we finally got to the finish line. I do remember some of the most kind of impactful moments for me were the body blows that came along the way. When
the change of heart.
all of a sudden we felt like we were good. And, Manchin woke up one day and said, no, we're not. And, Build Back Better was dead all of a sudden after we had got it all the way to what felt like the past the 1 yard line. We were probably on the inch line. And then all of a sudden it was dead. And so, I think we, went through that a few times. IRA went through that. I think those were the toughest moments, is because we felt like we were working so hard. We felt like we had understanding. We felt like, what was now going to be really not only industry changing, but I think it is going to be a world changing moment where we were going to have domestic policy in the U.S. that supported renewables, as I said, as true industrial policy. And we were going to be looked at from from the world stage that if the U.S. can do it, everybody can do it.
What's fascinating about how all that played out is for the longest time, Europe and the rest of the world had been saying, you're the superpower, you lead us. And we had disappointed the world as we withdrew from the Paris Climate Agreement and seen our push to clean energy stalled for a bit. But now, in the wake of the Inflation Reduction Act, you have Europe and the EU going with its own industrial green policy. Canada has put in similar subsidies on their end. So you're right, that domino effect did take place. It was not just about making sure that some solar companies can build panels in New Mexico.
No, exactly. I think that's what we all believed was going to happen. And I think that the industry was aligned, and Abby's leadership and her team were amazing. I mean, the amount of work they did, the sleepless nights that group, and the amount of miles they walked and meetings that they went in, and we spent tons of hours. I mean, I remember just unique opportunities we were so close with staff members that were in Senator Wyden's office and Senator Manchin's office, and really the amazing work gets done by the staff, right?
Sure.
I mean, the staff is grinding through these things word by word. And I remember text messaging on issues around how are we going to deal with defaults in labor provisions with late into the night here on the West Coast. So it was middle of the night on the East Coast, texting clauses about how is the industry really going to deal with these things. So I mean,
prevailing wage stuff. People are still scared about that, by the way, George. We're still waiting. Exactly.
But how do we deal with a foot fault that doesn't impact, if we have a labor miscalculation, how is it not going to have $100 million tax equity impact? Like, that is not financeable, or is not a contract that any of us are going to sign. And so trying to get policymakers to understand those impacts was, some of the best work that we did as an industry was, I think, really explaining how some of this stuff actually gets done when we're talking about signing contracts and making them bankable. And literally that was being done over text messages with staffers trying to realize what to do. One of the, and how to get it done quickly. And does this wording work? I mean, it was real sausage being made in a big way, which I think is people don't realize when they're talking about, how bills get passed. So that was really cool. Unfortunately, there was some stuff on the cutting room floor. I think that we missed on direct pay. I think direct pay would have been is an issue that the industry still could use as we're looking at, tax equity is a challenge. And if we're all successful, there's not enough tax equity to go around.
It's 4 guys doing
direct pay,
for the most part. That's what we talk about on this show all the time.
Yeah.
Is right? The only other option is to get all the corporates and the tech guys with these, RE100 goals to really get serious about participating. Otherwise, direct pay is the only way to do it. It's just not enough to go around.
Yeah. And there was a misunderstanding of where the benefit would go in direct pay. I think Senator Manchin said this is a giveaway to big companies and Wall Street. That was exactly the opposite.
Yeah, it takes away from the banks.
The big projects are going to get tax equity. Tax equity is still more beneficial than direct pay. So, the offshore wind market has slowed dramatically, but had those projects continue to move forward, you're talking about billions of dollars of tax equity that gets eaten up under one contract. That's much easier for Wells Fargo to do or JP Morgan to do than to do 1,000 community solar projects. And so what the reality of direct pay is those are going to be used by the community solar projects, the projects in rural communities that build industries. And, so that is one, if I look back at IRA, that I said, we missed that. We couldn't get that message across. We tried our best. And hopefully I'll be around for another fight for that, because I think that will be the next, that is the third leg of the stool in my mind. Now that you have good ITC policy, strong ITC policy, you have strong industrial support. If you could manage a direct pay structure that ensures that there is enough tax equity leverage to go around, this industry can do amazing things. It's going to do great things. It's going to do phenomenal things. It can do amazing things if you complete the cycle.
But you're talking about an impact to, small scale DG and small businesses and development shops with 10 or fewer people, right? Because we did a deep dive into tax equity and potential changes to the capital weighting rules that are being considered by all the central banks a couple of episodes ago, which could be a really big hit to the ITC market. But like you said, the utility scale guys, the developer partners you work with, they're getting tax equity. They can call up Bank of America and get that deal done. But the smaller ones doing 100 1 megawatt projects cannot. And that's a lot harder. So I appreciate you for pointing that out. George, let's close it out here. What is your favorite Abby Hopper story from the last 4 years? She is one of the best personalities our industry has, and is a huge asset to what we're doing on the policy side. She's also very fun to be around, and I'm sure can lead the charge quite well behind the scenes. So anyone that you would not get in trouble for telling me about. And by now we've been talking for an hour and 5 minutes, so no one's listening anyway. So go for it.
Yeah, exactly. Listen, I have a lot of great stories about Abby, and she is a fun person to be around. She is she's got energy like no other. I mean, she's the best hire the industry association could have ever done. I joke sometimes I'm the longest. I'm not the oldest, but I'm the longest tenured person on the board. I think I've been on the board since 2010 or 11.
You really had to point that out too. Now people are going to scroll through the bios and the headshots and be like, hey, who's George thrown under the bus?
No, I have worked with a few CEOs, but Abby is truly amazing, and I tell you, she is a wonderful spokesperson for the industry, and we have lots of funny stories that I will definitely get in trouble saying, so I won't talk about that. But what I will remember about Abby, and the times I've had with Abby, is as a person and a business leader. Some of those early days of COVID, we sat and talked for hours almost every day, because we were all stuck in our houses and we all had plenty of time to sit on Zoom calls, and we would talk for hours about the support of her people and how much she cared for each individual in her company. And, I saw a side of Abby that is not this tenacious, get it done, policy driven. I saw the true leader that she is, and the way that she supports and embraces her people. And I think that's one of the things that I think as a board we've all recognized, is that how her team rallies around her and how they support her mission. And that is the reason why there were, hours upon hours of meetings and time scheduled and Saturdays and Sundays and late nights, all by her team willing to fight not only for the industry, but fight to support Abby and her mission. And that is what leadership is all about. It's something that I have really enjoyed over the last 4 years, is to have her as a leader and a partner. She can rally the troops, and whether that's late night at a live music event somewhere that she loves so much, or
Caps game,
or on the stage at the RE Plus,
the exit row, West
yes.
Airlines. She's got a brand now.
Yeah, exactly. We all see her in flip flops, at least her feet in the exit row, and we know she's traveling to another place to talk to another solar company, and that's pretty cool.
George Hershman, thank you for so much time today. It's always great to talk to you, and congratulations on a very successful tenure as chair of the SEIA board. You guys have done some pretty incredible work, and it's been an up and down period. So kudos to you for navigating that.
Well, I appreciate that, and I'm going to stay around for a while. I'm going to. You may see me on LinkedIn running for executive committee. So
there you go. You got a taste.
I may stay around. I can't leave now. I've been around too long. So I'm sure I'll be involved in SEIA for quite some time.
You're going to stick around until you are the oldest person on the board. Is that the plan?
That's probably true. Why? What else would you rather do? Now we're in the front end of the large climb that this industry has to do ahead of it.
Thanks again to George Hershman for joining the podcast. Factor This is a production of Renewable Energy World and Clarion Energy. Join us every Monday as we break down solar's biggest stories with industry leaders who actually move the needle. And please leave a rating and review wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time on Factor This from Renewable Energy World.